It all started on a Friday morning, the kind of morning in Los Angeles where the sun promises a perfect weekend. But that promise was broken before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Without warning, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, descended upon the city. These weren't targeted operations against known criminals. This was a full-scale sweep. Federal agents appeared at construction sites in the Westlake District, in public spaces in Paramount, and near community hubs. The message was clear and terrifying: no one was safe. The raids created an immediate chill, a palpable fear that spread faster than any wildfire, gripping a county where 1 out of every 3 residents was born in another country. The scope of the operation was staggering and, frankly, unprecedented in its brazenness. ICE agents swept up not just undocumented workers, but documented residents as well, people who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Reports indicated that over 2 days, around 150 people were detained, a number confirmed by Trump's own border czar, Tom Homan. But the numbers don't tell the full story. They don't capture the image of a father being pulled from a job site while his co-workers watched in horror, or the panic that ensued when rumors spread of agents near schools and hospitals. This wasn't just immigration enforcement, it was a deliberate act of psychological warfare waged against entire communities. Among those caught in the dragnet was David Huerta, a respected union leader and the president of SEIU California. His detention sent shockwaves through the state's labor movement and political circles, signaling that this was not a routine action. This was a direct assault on the structures of Californian society, targeting not just individuals, but the very organizations that give them a voice. The arrest of a figure like Huerta demonstrated that the administration's goal was broader than simply deporting immigrants. It was about dismantling any form of organized resistance within a state that has long stood in opposition to the Trump agenda. It was a power play, pure and simple, designed to intimidate and destabilize. The chaos was intentional. The White House knew that targeting both legal and undocumented residents, including those with no criminal records, would sow maximum fear and confusion. This wasn't about making America safer. It was about making a point. It was about showing California, the bastion of democratic resistance, who was in charge. The raids were the opening salvo in a calculated campaign to provoke a crisis, to turn the streets of a vibrant, diverse city into a battlefield. The administration lit the fuse, then stood back and waited for the inevitable explosion, ready to use the ensuing turmoil for its own political gain. The explosion came swiftly. As news of the raids and detentions spread across social media and local news channels, Angelenos poured into the streets. The fear that had gripped the communities in the morning morphed into a raw, powerful anger by the afternoon. Thousands of protesters converged on the Edward R. Roybal Federal Building downtown, the site where many of the detainees were rumored to be held. The crowd was a cross-section of the city itself: students, activists, families, union members, and ordinary citizens who felt compelled to stand against what they saw as a grave injustice. Their chants echoed off the glass and steel of the skyscrapers, a defiant roar against the federal crackdown. The protests quickly escalated from peaceful gatherings to disruptive acts of civil disobedience. Demonstrators, desperate to make their voices heard and to grind the city to a halt, spilled onto the major arteries of Los Angeles. The 101 and 110 freeways, lifelines of the sprawling metropolis, became seas of people, bringing traffic to a standstill for miles. But as the sun set, the mood darkened. Clashes erupted between protesters and law enforcement. What began as chants and banners turned into rocks, bottles, and fireworks being hurled at police lines. The air, once filled with cries for justice, became thick with the acrid smell of tear gas and smoke from burning barricades. The response from law enforcement was swift and heavy-handed. The Los Angeles Police Department and California Highway Patrol, while stating they were not involved in the federal immigration raids, were tasked with quelling the unrest. They deployed riot squads armed with batons, tear gas, flashbang grenades, and rubber bullets. The sight of police in tactical gear firing non-lethal rounds into crowds of American citizens was a jarring spectacle, turning parts of downtown LA into what looked like a war zone. Amid the chaos, vehicles were set ablaze, including several futuristic-looking Waymo driverless cars, their silent, automated progress consumed by the flames of human rage. A gas station was looted, and the authorities declared an unlawful assembly, leading to dozens of arrests. This was the chaos the Trump administration had been counting on. The images of burning cars and violent confrontations broadcast across the nation played directly into the narrative they wanted to build. It allowed them to frame the protesters not as concerned citizens reacting to government overreach, but as a violent mob, as insurrectionists who needed to be controlled by a stronger hand. The violence, which stemmed directly from the initial provocation of the raids, was now being used as the justification for the next, more drastic step in their plan. The cycle of provocation and reaction was complete, setting the stage for a federal intervention that would bypass state authority entirely. Just as the chaos in Los Angeles reached its zenith, President Trump made his move. He didn't call the governor, he didn't consult with the mayor, he simply acted. In a move that stunned legal experts and political observers, Trump invoked a little-known federal statute, 10 U.S.C. 12,406, to federalize the California National Guard. With the stroke of a pen, he seized control of 2,000 of the state's own troops, placing them under his direct command. This wasn't a request for assistance. It was a hostile takeover of a state's security apparatus. The president, who had long railed against federal overreach, was now using the full might of the federal government to override the will of a sovereign state. The justification was the protection of federal property, a flimsy pretext for such an unprecedented action. About 300 of the newly federalized Guard members were deployed to downtown Los Angeles, forming a cordon around federal buildings. But their presence did little to de-escalate the situation. Instead, it was a profound provocation, a visual symbol of a federal occupation. To make the threat even more explicit, the administration put an additional 500 U.S. Marines from the nearby base at 29 Palms on standby. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth appeared on television, warning that the Marines were ready to be deployed if the violence continued, violence that the administration itself had ignited. The legal and constitutional implications were staggering. Governors are the commanders-in-chief of their state's National Guard unless they are called into federal service under specific, legally defined circumstances, typically with the governor's consent, or in a case of actual insurrection. By bypassing Governor Gavin Newsom entirely, Trump was asserting a level of presidential power that bordered on dictatorial. He was treating a state, one of the largest economies in the world, as a rebellious province that needed to be brought to heel. It was a direct challenge to the principles of federalism that have underpinned the American system of government for over 2 centuries. This was no longer about immigration. This was a raw power grab. Trump, through his official channels and his own fiery rhetoric, labeled the protesters insurrectionists and declared his intention to liberate Los Angeles from the migrant invasion. He wasn't trying to restore order. He was escalating the conflict to justify an even greater show of force. The threat of invoking the Insurrection Act, a law that would allow him to deploy active-duty military on U.S. soil to suppress civil disorder, hung heavy in the air. The deployment of the Guard and the standby order for the Marines were a clear signal that the president was willing to use the military against American citizens to achieve his political goals. The reaction from California's leadership was one of unified outrage. Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, who had been deliberately cut out of the loop, vehemently condemned the federal intervention. They didn't mince words. They called the deployment illegal, unconstitutional, and a dangerous escalation designed to inflame an already volatile situation. Newsom, in a fiery press conference, called President Trump a stone-cold liar and accused him of manufacturing a crisis for political theater. He immediately announced that the state would be filing a lawsuit against the Trump administration, challenging the legality of federalizing the National Guard without his consent. The state's elected officials saw the move for what it was, a calculated assault on California's autonomy. Senator Alex Padilla and Congresswoman Maxine Waters, both prominent voices of the Democratic resistance, accused the White House of intentionally orchestrating the entire sequence of events. They argued that the raids were the bait, the protests were the predictable reaction, and the military deployment was the predetermined outcome. It was, in their view, a playbook for authoritarianism, a test case for how the federal government could impose its will on any state that dared to defy the president. The goal, they asserted, was to crush dissent in a state that represents the heart of the opposition. The White House, however, doubled down. Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, issued a chilling warning to the state's leaders. He declared that officials like Newsom and Bass could face federal charges or even arrest for what he termed impeding federal ICE operations. This was an unprecedented threat against a sitting governor and mayor, blurring the lines between political disagreement and criminal conduct. It was a clear attempt to intimidate and silence any official who spoke out against the administration's actions. The federal government was no longer a partner to the states. It was an adversary, willing to use the threat of prosecution to enforce compliance. The sentiment was echoed by civil rights leaders and community organizers across the state. Jose Barrera of the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, accused the administration of deliberately creating civic unrest to justify a military-style takeover. The narrative was becoming clearer by the hour. This wasn't a response to an emergency. It was the creation of one. High-profile Democrats from across the country, including Vice President Kamala Harris and Senator Bernie Sanders, joined the chorus of condemnation, denouncing Trump's actions as authoritarian and a grave threat to American democracy. The battle lines were drawn, not just on the streets of LA, but in the very definition of presidential power. The timing of this manufactured crisis was not lost on anyone. As federal troops patrolled the streets of an American city, the White House was deep in preparation for another grand spectacle, a massive military parade down the streets of Washington, D.C. This wasn't for a national holiday like the 4th of July. It was for President Trump's 79th birthday. The juxtaposition was stark and, honestly, deeply unsettling. While one of the nation's largest states was being treated like an occupied territory, the president was planning a lavish, self-aggrandizing celebration of his own power, complete with tanks, flyovers, and thousands of marching soldiers. It was a display straight from the playbook of authoritarian leaders, designed to project strength and intimidate rivals. Critics immediately drew the connection, viewing the chaos in California as the perfect backdrop for Trump's pageant of power. The parade was meant to be a showcase of military might under his command, and what better way to underscore that message than by simultaneously deploying that might against a domestic political opponent? The images of troops in Los Angeles would serve as a real-world demonstration of the power being celebrated in Washington. It transformed the birthday parade from a mere vanity project into a chilling statement of intent, a declaration that the armed forces were a tool of his personal will, to be used against enemies both foreign and domestic. Adding another layer to this political theater was the conspicuous silence from the White House regarding Pride Month. Throughout June, the administration had failed to issue any official recognition or proclamation, a stark departure from previous administrations, and honestly, a deliberate snub to the LGBTQ+ community. This was particularly resonant given that the crackdown was happening in California, a state long at the forefront of LGBTQ+ rights and advocacy. The refusal to acknowledge Pride Month while simultaneously orchestrating a crisis in the heart of progressive America was seen as a calculated cultural message. It was a signal to his base that the values represented by California were under attack. These actions, when viewed together, paint a picture of a presidency obsessed with the symbols of dictatorial power. The military parade, the suppression of a progressive state, and the erasure of cultural milestones like Pride Month are all part of the same strategy. It's about creating an image of an all-powerful leader who stands for a specific, narrow vision of America, and who is willing to use any means necessary to crush those who represent a different one. The events in California were not an isolated incident. They were a chapter in a larger narrative, a carefully staged performance designed to consolidate power and project an aura of unchallengeable authority. For years, the relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk had been a bizarre but mutually beneficial alliance. Musk, the visionary tech billionaire, provided Trump with a veneer of innovation and a powerful ally in the corporate world. In return, Musk's companies, particularly Tesla and SpaceX, received immense financial and regulatory support from the federal government. This support was crucial for their growth, helping them dominate the electric vehicle market and the new space race. Trump often touted Musk's achievements as examples of American genius, conveniently linking his own presidency to their success. It was a transactional relationship built on money, power, and shared publicity. But as with so many of Trump's alliances, this one was destined to crumble. The turning point came when Musk, perhaps feeling the pressure from his California-based employees and his more liberal-leaning customer base, began to subtly distance himself from the administration's increasingly authoritarian rhetoric. He made public statements about the importance of free speech and expressed concern over the growing political polarization. For a president who demands absolute loyalty, this mild dissent was an unforgivable betrayal. Trump saw Musk not as an independent business leader, but as an asset he had cultivated. When that asset began to show signs of independent thought, it was time to demonstrate who held the real power. The retaliation was swift and brutal, designed to cripple the very companies Trump had once championed. The administration announced a sudden and comprehensive review of all federal contracts and subsidies awarded to Tesla and SpaceX. Government orders for Tesla's electric vehicle fleet were abruptly canceled. Crucial federal grants supporting battery research and charging infrastructure were frozen. The message to Musk was unambiguous. The hand that gives can also take away. The full weight of the federal government was weaponized against him, not for any business failure or legal wrongdoing, but for a perceived lack of fealty. The attack on Musk's empire served a dual purpose for Trump. First, it was a powerful warning to other corporate leaders: stay in line, or you're next. It showed that no one, not even the world's richest man, was immune from the president's wrath. Second, it provided a convenient source of funds for his own priorities. The money saved by cutting off support for Tesla and SpaceX could be redirected. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about reallocating resources to fuel his own political projects, turning the screws on a former ally to fund his ever-expanding vision of personal power. The spectacular downfall of the Trump-Musk alliance was a cautionary tale about the perils of dealing with a leader who values loyalty above all else. With billions of dollars suddenly freed up from the canceled contracts and frozen subsidies meant for Elon Musk's companies, the Trump administration had a windfall to spend. But this money wasn't reinvested into other innovative technologies or used to shore up the national debt. Instead, it was funneled directly into the president's pet projects, primarily those that enhanced his personal image and consolidated his power. The first and most obvious beneficiary was the Department of Defense, but not for national security in the traditional sense. A significant portion of the funds was earmarked for domestic operations, including the very deployment of the National Guard and Marines in California. This redirection of funds represented a profound shift in national priorities. Vital federal programs that had served communities for decades found their budgets slashed to make way for the administration's new focus. Funding for the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, long targeted by conservatives, was gutted. These programs, which support cultural institutions, artists, and scholars across the country, were deemed non-essential. Money for public broadcasting, which provides educational programming and independent news, was also dramatically reduced. The message was that culture, art, and critical thought were luxuries the nation could no longer afford, especially when there were military parades to fund. The environmental and scientific communities also took a major hit. The Environmental Protection Agency saw its budget for climate change research and renewable energy initiatives reallocated. Scientific grants administered by the National Science Foundation, particularly those related to climate science and public health, were put on indefinite hold. It was a systematic defunding of the very institutions responsible for safeguarding the nation's future, both environmentally and intellectually. The money that could have been used to develop clean energy or prepare for the next pandemic was instead being used to pay for the logistics of moving troops to Los Angeles and planning the president's birthday celebration. This wasn't just fiscal policy, it was an ideological statement. Trump was actively dismantling the parts of the federal government that represented a progressive, forward-looking vision of America, one based on science, art, and environmental stewardship. In their place, he was building a government focused on internal security, military spectacle, and the suppression of dissent. By cutting off funds to Tesla and SpaceX and redirecting them to his own priorities, he was not just punishing a disloyal ally, he was reshaping the entire federal budget to reflect his personal worldview, one where the projection of power is the only investment that matters. Throughout his presidency, Donald Trump has wielded his power to pardon with a flair for the dramatic and a keen eye for public relations. His choices often seem designed to generate headlines and appeal to specific demographics, rather than to correct miscarriages of justice. This pattern has become even more pronounced, creating a stark contrast between who gets a presidential reprieve and who is left to languish. He has shown a remarkable willingness to pardon Black celebrities, rappers, and athletes who have faced legal troubles, often staging high-profile White House events to announce the clemency. These acts are presented as proof of his fairness and his commitment to criminal justice reform. However, a closer look reveals a deeply cynical calculation at play. While headline-grabbing celebrities receive pardons, Black leaders and activists who have fought for civil rights and racial justice are consistently ignored. These are individuals who have challenged the system, who have organized for political change, and whose activism represents a threat to the established order. People who have spent decades in prison for their involvement in movements like the Black Panthers or other liberation struggles remain behind bars. The message is clear. Trump is willing to help Black individuals whose fame can be leveraged for his own political benefit, but not those whose life's work is dedicated to systemic change. This selective use of the pardon power is a form of political theater. It allows the president to create the illusion that he is on the side of the Black community without actually supporting the policies or leaders that community advocates for. Pardoning a famous rapper generates positive media coverage and can be used as a talking point to counter accusations of racism. It's a transactional form of mercy, offered not out of a sense of justice, but in exchange for a public relations victory. It helps him maintain a sliver of support among minority voters while simultaneously pursuing policies that harm those same communities, such as the aggressive immigration raids in places like Los Angeles. Ultimately, this strategy reveals a profound disdain for the very idea of a justice system based on principles. For Trump, justice is a tool, something to be dispensed or withheld based on its utility to his personal brand and political agenda. The pardon is not about righting wrongs, it's about rewarding friends, creating photo opportunities, and building a narrative of a benevolent leader. By favoring celebrity over substance and image over impact, he exposes his core belief that power is not a public trust to be administered fairly, but a personal weapon to be used to shape his own legacy, one headline at a time. When you connect all the dots, the picture that emerges is not one of random chaos, but of a deliberate and systematic plan. The ICE raids in California were not just about immigration. They were the first move in a chess game designed to provoke and conquer. The ensuing protests, the violent clashes, and the burning cars were not unforeseen consequences. They were the desired outcome, providing the perfect pretext for the next phase. The unilateral deployment of the National Guard and the threat of using Marines against American citizens was the checkmate, a demonstration of ultimate federal power over a defiant state. This entire saga is a microcosm of the Trump presidency's core objective, the complete subjugation of any and all opposition. Every action, from the grand to the seemingly trivial, serves this goal. The rejection of Pride Month is a cultural assault on a progressive stronghold. The ostentatious military parade for his birthday is a projection of strongman imagery. The vindictive betrayal of a corporate titan like Elon Musk is a warning to any other elites who might consider stepping out of line. The selective pardons for celebrities are a cynical ploy to manipulate public perception while ignoring true advocates for justice. Each piece fits into a larger mosaic of control. This is not about making America great, or even about serving the interests of his supporters. It is about the insatiable pursuit of personal power and the construction of a legacy built on dominance. The federal programs defunded to pay for these spectacles, programs for science, art, and the environment, represent the future that is being sacrificed at the altar of the president's ego. He is more interested in the transient glory of a parade than in the long-term health of the planet or the cultural enrichment of the nation. His loyalty is not to the country, but to his own image as an unchallengeable leader. What we are witnessing is the methodical implementation of an authoritarian blueprint. It is a strategy designed to silence dissent, intimidate political rivals, and centralize power in the executive branch to an unprecedented degree. The events in California serve as a chilling case study, a warning of what happens when one person's will is allowed to supersede the law, the Constitution, and the democratic process. The goal is to create a political landscape where resistance is impossible, where loyalty is the only currency, and where the president's power is absolute. This is the legacy Donald Trump is building, one crushed voice at a time. Across continents and ideologies, a familiar pattern emerges whenever leaders seek to entrench their power. The federal intervention in California under President Trump draws chilling parallels to other high-profile conflicts on the world stage, namely Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the enduring struggle between Israel and Palestine in Gaza. In each case, the playbook is strikingly similar. A perceived threat, whether it's a rebellious state, a neighboring nation, or a marginalized population, is cast as justification for overwhelming force. In California, the ICE raids and military deployments were framed as necessary for national security. In Ukraine, Putin's narrative of protecting ethnic Russians masked a calculated move to redraw borders and project strength. In Gaza, Israel's heavy-handed responses to unrest are justified as self-defense, often at the expense of civilian lives. The tactics converge: sudden, unannounced raids, the deployment of overwhelming military force, the targeting of key infrastructure, and the use of psychological operations to sow confusion and fear. These maneuvers serve dual purposes: quelling dissent on the ground and sending an unmistakable message to both allies and adversaries. The result is a climate of fear and uncertainty, where resistance is painted as treason and loyalty is demanded, not earned. Political motivations are just as aligned. Each leader invokes a narrative of existential threat to legitimize extraordinary measures, leveraging nationalism and fear to consolidate control. The true objective is not merely security, but the suppression of opposition and the reinforcement of personal power. The parallels are stark. Democratic norms are sidelined, dissent is criminalized, and the machinery of the state is repurposed to serve the ambitions of a single individual or ruling faction. For local populations, the consequences are devastating. Communities are torn apart, families displaced, and lives lost, all in service of a larger political agenda. The world watches as the same cycle repeats, leaders exploiting crisis to rewrite the rules, redraw the lines, and silence those who dare to resist. The intervention in California is not an isolated event. It is part of a global trend, a warning that the tools of authoritarianism are not bound by geography or ideology. Whether in Sacramento, Kiev, or Gaza City, the pattern is the same. Power, once seized, is rarely surrendered willingly. And wherever it is challenged, the response is swift, decisive, and often brutal. The lesson is clear. The struggle for democracy and human rights is not confined to any one nation. It is a universal battle, fought wherever those in power seek to put themselves above the law, and wherever ordinary people dare to push back.